You are listening to the podcast That's Life in Sweden, or as we say in Swedish, Sånt, livet i Sverige, with me, your host, Lisa Åsimäki. Today's guest is Professor John Hattie, who is without doubt one of our world's most respected educators and authors. He is, of course, the author of the 2008 highly influential book titled Visible Learning. He is also the chair of the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leadership. Hello and welcome to the program, John Hattie. How are you?
I'm very good, Soka, and I assume you're very good too?
Yes, I am. All good. I think I'm just coming out of a cold, so feeling much better. The weather hasn't really helped, in Melbourne. It's been winter, but I did hear on Sunday night, well, it's starting to move towards warmer.
Yesterday was the shortest day, so yes, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, well, there you are. What, according to you, is the purpose of schooling?
Well, we decided 150 years ago that educators were and should be better at helping kids understand their learning, helping develop their character, helping develop their strategies of learning. And I think one of the major purposes of schooling is to augment what they get at the home or what they don't get in the home. And I think, therefore, there is an argument that in any society, the society values need to permeate through the schooling, which in our Western countries is done in the ballot box, primarily also by involving community in debates about curriculum and what we consider precious knowledge that we should pass on to students. So the purpose of schooling is multidimensional. It is about developing character. It is about developing students' knowledge and understanding. It is about turning them on to the love of learning, and it is about helping them respect themselves and respect others.
So you're not connecting then, I think about schooling a lot of times, well, we did schooling so that we're going to do certain professions and we're going to be job ready and all of that. And there's been a kind of a shift back to that job readiness, even though we don't know what jobs we are going to be doing.
Well, I take a different view. A few years ago, a Danish philosopher, Sted Larsen, Leppe Larsen, he actually came out to Australia here, and we spent some weeks and then many months writing a book called The Purpose of Schooling. And one of the arguments I certainly make in that is children are children. They're not many adults. We don't create their future. They create their future. We create the present. And in that present, we need to make sure that we have certain values, certain mores, certain character attributes at the moment that children are children, because that's what they will recall from us and grow from. I don't think we are preparing them for some future. They will prepare for their future. We are to prepare them now. And that's why I look particularly at turning them on to the love of learning. And obviously then the debate is about learning about what, and that's a very healthy debate.
So what do you think the learning is about? It's about the character and developing the children's or student love for learning.
Well, it's all that, but then learning is about something. And so that notion that we do have knowledge that we think is valuable, we do have understandings and ways of looking at the world. We want our students to understand that there are alternative ways of interpreting the facts and the knowledge. And what are the ways in which you can then lead to truth, wisdom and beauty, and try to understand that. And we want, you read any 3-year-old, they are absolutely imbued with curiosity. That's what we need to maintain. And sometimes we don't actually maintain that curiosity as we start to drum in the evidence and the facts. But that curiosity about the evidence is what we want to inculcate and have our students develop.
So I guess then I'm thinking about the reason and your message in writing the book Visible Learning, and that was published in 2011.
2008.
Oh, 2008. Has anything changed in the way you think about what you wrote then to what is happening today?
Well, Circa, I'm in the final stages of writing a sequel to that book 10, 15 years later. And part of the reason for writing the sequel is exactly this question. I've learned a lot over the last 15 years. The team has implemented the major messages from visible learning in around 10,000 plus schools. So I've learned a lot from doing that. The fundamental message about moving the debate away from what works to what works best hasn't changed. The message about let's focus less on what the teachers do and what they think about what they do, how we can move engagement away from doing to learning. I think I've learned a lot about lots of different aspects. I also make no apology for focusing on achievement. As I said to your first question, it's part of the purpose of the critical part. Of course, there are many other things, and one of the things that we've learned over the 10 or so years is that others have come in and done what I've done to visible learning on achievement, they've done to motivation, the team out of Germany. There's others have looked at learning strategies, looked at well-being. And so I think that's advances are dramatic. Here's the biggest shift, however. 15, 20 years ago, I don't think teachers and school leaders would have come to educational research and even pay much attention to it. Now they do. And they're very critical in a very positive, critical way about it. They triangulate that research with what they have as evidence in their school and their own noticing and their own beliefs. And I think that's a dramatic change in the last 10 years, much to the healthier.
And that sounds really positive.
It is. And I think it's now hard to meet policy people who aren't at least aware of the research. Whereas 20 odd years ago, they could ignore it and do what they like. They can't do that anymore as easily. And I certainly think the school leaders in particular have become very sophisticated. I think my own personal reaction is that over the last 10 or 15 years, I've actually been subject to the world's best critics. And what greater honor can you have, particularly as an academic, to have people who critique your work? Most academic articles no one ever reads, let alone cites or critiques. So the fact that there's a lot of critique out there, I think is a very healthy situation. And I've learned a lot from it.
And you know what? I think that is a perfect response. And it's so exciting to hear you say that there are actually teachers and school leaders who are interested in what you have written. And they're particularly, and it has got to do that they try out things in their classrooms, the different ideas, and then they compare that to your findings.
Correct.
Which is exactly how it should be.
Exactly. But one of the things that we focused on since the 2008 book is trying to dive deeper into that essence of what it is that leads to the effective teacher and school leader. And what I've been exploring is it's not what teachers do, it's how they think about what they do. And that evaluative thinking that underlies those very successful teachers and school leaders, of which there are many throughout the world. I think that's a very exciting focus of what I'm doing now, is trying to understand that thinking and trying to get, in many schools, to get some of those teachers who have incredible impact on kids to get their thinking more public. It's a very, very private affair. We talk about what we do. We talk about how we teach. We talk about our lesson plans. We talk about our kids. We need to talk a lot more about our thinking, our expectations, our understanding of what impact means. And when that happens, it's really exciting.
But you know what? Teachers are pretty shy.
Well, it's a strange profession because we put people in classrooms on day one. We then, after 10 or so years, they look around and say, how did I get to be the teacher I am today? It's because of what they did. It's not a very collaborative profession. However, people coming into our profession have been brought up in a social media world that's totally different, and they're expecting collaboration. And I worry about our future of the independent contractor, the privateer in our school systems. It's done us well in the past, but it's not going to do us well in the future. We have to be a lot more collaborative and actually start to think aloud in staff rooms, in classrooms, in the system to better understand that thinking.
Interesting. So thinking about the pandemic, do you think the pandemic is a catalyst for educational change?
Look, Circa, I would love the answer to be yes. One of the things I did in the early days of the pandemic is I looked at all the research I could find on the effects of floods, earthquakes, fires, hurricanes, wars, and say, well, what did we do in those circumstances? Because learning didn't stop in all those circumstances. It was different. And COVID certainly showed us, like, if you look at the regular classroom and the traditional grammar of schooling, we talk a lot. We talk 80 to 90% of the time. We ask up to 200 questions a day requiring less than 3-word responses. 90% plus of our focus, written, verbal, in the classroom is on facts and knowledge. You couldn't do that online. You suddenly had to give up conducting the orchestra and release responsibility. You had to teach students how to work by themselves and work in groups with others. You had to be much more clear about what success looked like and not just give them tasks to do. You didn't have the oversight of making sure that they stayed on task regardless, that relentless pursuit of engagement that some teachers do. And believe it or not, there's already 3 meta-analyses about the effects of COVID. And the average effect size from all 3 meta-analyses is about minus 0.1 to minus 0.15. Think circa of the disruption. Think of the unemployment. Think of the equity. Think of the resourcing. Think of the death. Think of the difficulties some kids had in the home. Why is it that the average effect is between the start of the year and the end of the year compared to all previous years is so trivial? No more than the summer school effect.
Wow. And
I put that down to the incredible expertise of teachers. Here's one of the frustrations about our business, Lisa. We are pretty good at finding problems and fixing them. We're pretty hopeless at finding success and scaling it up. And it's kind of like you said before, teachers are shy. Teachers don't want to talk about their own expertise. They're kind. They want to give credit to the students, to the resources, to the parents. And one of the hardest things in the work we do in schools is to teachers to take attribution for their success. Why were you so successful with the student? And start from that. And then build up from that. It's so easy to go to the negative and say, well, you failed the student, you didn't do very well here. Well, most great teachers knew that before you had to tell them. And they want to talk to you about how they're coming up with solutions and positive ways. And so it's kind of like the whole endemic of education is about failure. Now, I know why. There's money in failure.
Oh.
It's a bit like every year here in Australia, a report comes out about how terrible school leaders are in terms of their stress and their workload and all that kind of stuff. And then you say, wait a moment. If you look at the TALIS results for Australia, 95% plus of principals say that's a great job and they would recommend it to anyone else. And so the disconnect there is easily resolved. School leaders are incredibly good at having coping strategies to deal with stress. Why do we weaponize the negative and not emphasize the positive? Now, I don't want to be Pollyanna here. Being a school leader can be a very stressful job.
Yep.
But most principals work out very quickly great coping strategies or they don't survive. And we should be esteeming that and saying that's the expertise that we want. It's not everybody can do it, but those who can do it incredibly well. But that negative creates more media, more mileage. And I just think it's a real travesty that we don't emphasize it. During COVID, every parent saw the incredible expertise that teachers and school leaders had. And we've gone back and forgotten it. And now we see parents as purveyors of homework and teachers as babysitters. That is a travesty.
Wow. Now that's putting it in a way that, my goodness. And I would imagine that every time there is something good that happens, people are straight away onto it and we want to hold on to things that work and we want to talk about it. And what you are saying is, no, that's not of interest.
One of the fascinations was I looked at in the 20th century, at the start of the 20th century, 14% of the world was literate and numerate. By the end of the 20th century, 86% of the world was literate and numerate. We went from 14 to 86% literate and numerate in one century, and I just think that is unbelievably phenomenal. When we write the history of the 20th century, that is dramatic. Here's my issue, Lisa. When I ask audiences to explain that. What is the best explanation? It takes them a long time to get to the answer that I think is the only answer. It wasn't because of communication. It wasn't because of textbooks. It wasn't because of all these other matters. It was simply because of teachers.
So what do we do in order to enhance, if you like, the status of teachers?
Well, the argument that I'm certainly pursuing is that we've got to start by talking about their expertise. Like during COVID, parents saw that they struggled at times with their own kid in terms of what they had to do, getting the kid motivated to get up and turn the Zoom on and all that stuff. Teachers do that in high school, 200 kids a day for 5 hours for 200 days a year, and do a lot more than just motivate the kids. What is the nature of that expertise? And it's kind of like, I don't know if you've seen that television program, Super Nanny.
Yeah.
It's kind of like super teachers. We need to be better communicators to our parents of the expertise we have. And I think that's the way we esteem our profession. We need to change our current structure of appointment and promotion to be based on expertise. At the moment, it's primarily based on age and experience. And whilst that is one consideration that I do care about, it's not based on expertise. Lisa, if you spent $100,000 of your own money to improve your teaching over the next year, other than your family, who would know and who would care?
Yeah.
Isn't that sad?
Very sad. That is very sad.
Every other profession does it. They invest incredibly in ongoing learning, but they tie it to expertise and promotion. We don't. Now, to be fair, there are some countries in the world that do. I've been working in Singapore over the last few years, and they have a model that after 2 or 3 years of being a teacher, you choose become a specialist teacher, a school leader, or a specialist in like an assessment or a literacy expert in the school. And your promotion, your professional development's tied to improving your skills at doing that. And they are much more able to attract people into a profession. People want to come into a profession where they can grow their expertise. They don't want to come in and just do the time. I think it's a chance to change the story.
Why isn't there a kind of a link or back to university to, like you talk about the Singaporean teachers, that there is possibility, for example, in Sweden, it's very common for teachers to come in and do a master's.
That's starting to change here, but I think there's a more immediate problem. When I stopped being a dean in a previous institution, I realised that any influence I had on teacher education was out the window. So I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go into a different area. So I focused on teachers in their first 3 years in schools. Lisa, there is no organisation. There is no conference. There is hardly any references. There's virtually nothing for them. And they are the hungriest, most exciting people to work with. When we did our survey a few years ago in aitsl, 95% of principals claimed they had an excellent induction program for which less than 40% of their teachers knew about. And most of that induction was into the system. It wasn't into the profession. And so I think that's another matter. You look at most other professions, those first 3 or 4 years on the job, we give an incredible amount of support. We don't do that in teaching. And that sink or swim notion that we have at the moment, I think is a worry. Like we can talk for hours about teacher education, how to improve it. But if we don't also improve those first 3 years, we're not actually changing much.
Wondering, how confident are you about teachers' principals' voice being included in any policy-making process at the state and federal government, if you look at the situation as it is now?
Well, that's a really good dilemma, because I look around here in Australia, we have 40 or 50 different associations of principals. And I've met with quite a few of them over the years, and I have a common question I ask them all. What do you stand for? And I struggle to get an answer out of it. Let me now go back to COVID. During the COVID 2 years, I don't know a single government in the world that came up with a policy to help school leaders and teachers teach other than whether schools should open or close. During those 2 years, I saw more policy being developed in and across schools by teachers and school leaders in dramatically powerful ways. And it was fed up through the system. Now we rush back to the old normal. We're ignoring that. And the point you're making, like I'm not naive and Pollyanna to believe that principals will all agree. But how do we create a forum that gets that power of teachers and school leaders into the system? Like at the moment, we have ring fences around schools, and there's the principal look outside their fence, and the government comes up with policies, throws it over the fence, and it's the principal's job to implement it or not. It's kind of worked, but it's not a very successful method. Can you imagine the Minister of Health coming up with a policy and not worrying about what the doctors and the medicos would say? That's not true in education. The system can come up with any answers. I think that's missing. And I've seen different states here in Australia try ways to get groups of expert principals to work together to inform policy. But then they get into role clarification problems and they think their job is to be mentors of other principals, and that misses the point. I don't think we've been very smart as a profession. And I look particularly to the professional associations and say, you've got to be a lot smarter about lobbying ideas, about pulling together ideas, about getting the hearts and minds of the profession. Like no minister is going to take a policy that's got the hearts and minds of the profession behind it and say that's nonsense. No minister is going to come up with a policy which doesn't have the hearts and minds of the profession behind it and expect it to succeed. But unfortunately, we do have this throwing over the fence kind of mentality with policy, and I just think it's a missed opportunity. So I would love to see the profession taking on a much more active role in debating, in formulating, in trialling, and in suggesting policy.
And what do you think the chances are that that will happen?
Sadly, not much, because we rush back to the old normal. We have this absurd notion that every principal is allowed their autonomy, and that gets in the way of cross-collaboration. We have many schools that are competitive to find kids each year, which gets in the way. And we haven't actually built and invested in principal leadership groups that can inform right policy. Like writing policy is not easy. It's not as simple as saying, I do it in my school, it works. It has to work across 500, 5,000 schools. It's not easy. But what better people to do it than those that have to implement it across 50 to 200 teachers in a school?
So what do you think of Teach for Australia?
Well, I have a lot of time for it because I'm interested in any program that focuses on the evidence of its impact. I worry sometimes about their publicity and communication getting in the way, and I also, a few years ago, we ran that program at the University of Melbourne, the exact same program we ran for our own students, but the Teach for Australia program is 5 times more expensive. It's a very expensive way of doing it. Is it a good program? Yes, it gets some stunning people into our profession that would never come into our profession. So I have no difficulty with it. I'm more worried about those programs of teacher education that have a very low impact on their teacher candidates and therefore on the students in their schools. Teach for Australia is not one of those. It's like, as you said earlier, Lisa, it's getting teacher education as an inbuilt part of the job, not what you do after school and on weekends, but it's part of the job. Like the biggest impact on the whole visible learning work is when teachers work together to evaluate their impact. There's no kid in the room. And I just think that's an incredible effect on kids. Now that needs time. That needs a lot of debate and critique about what we mean by impact. And it's a lot more than achievement. I think it needs a lot of work in terms of what we mean by evaluation. We need safety and trust, because, Lisa, if I critiqued your work, like if I said to you, bring along a piece of child's work now and 3 months later, or 3 months distance between them, and we had a discussion of whether that's 3 months growth. Sometimes, having done this exercise, the work after 3 months is not as good as the work at the beginning. Now that goes to the heart of that teacher's concept of impact. It's scary, but quite frankly, We have to do that because it's not fair on kids if teachers have very low expectations and very weird senses of progress. So building up safety to do it, building up those social sensitivity skills of critique, standing in other people's shoes. And when it happens, and it does happen a lot in our current system, it's magic. And that's what we should be doing a lot more of. At the moment, we send people along to programs, they sit there for a day and they come away with a few tips and tricks. That is not a good model of professional development. It is about questioning and critiquing and evaluating the way in which you think about your work. And of course, seeing other ways of doing that.
You brought up something that really caught my attention was teach back.
That's something that my colleagues invented during the COVID thing. Like, if you look at the research on peer tutoring, it's most powerful on the person doing the teaching. Unfortunately, peer tutoring is often implemented with the older student teaching the younger student, or the brighter student teaching the not so bright student. And yeah, it works, but it's not well received. So we turned it on its head and said, well, let's do teach back. And so in the school at Doug and Nancy are the principals of, they had Teach Back Tuesday. So on every Tuesday, the student had to teach another student, a group of students, their parents or the teacher, what they've been learning over the last week. And the effect was dramatic, because suddenly the students had to understand not just the knowledge, but the ways and relationships between ideas. They had to anticipate where there would be difficulties and the challenge of the work. They had to hear some of their colleagues not understanding what they were saying, realizing that they didn't know it as deep as they thought they did. And it really opened up the notion. And if you take the line I do, that we want students to become their own teachers, why aren't we teaching them those skills when they're 5? Actually, 5-year-olds can do it. By age 8, they've learned to sit there and watch the teacher do the work. I think this is where this notion of teach back has been a very powerful notion to help students get a much deeper understanding. And they actually enjoy doing it as well. So, and I think this is where it's more than peer-to-peer. Too often when peer-to-peer teaching is implemented, it's implemented at the content stage. And if students teach each other the wrong content, they're more likely to remember it and it sticks. It is the relationship between ideas. It's in a sense, teaching them the joy of that relationship between ideas is what Teach Back's about. So yes, we've learned a lot over the last couple of years how to structure Teach Back sessions, but it really is now part and parcel of the school in San Diego where Doug and Nancy are running.
So wouldn't that be also something interesting for teachers themselves? I'm receiving that feedback that what I believe is going to make me or help me become better at what I do.
Yes, but again, I'd make sure that one of the troubles having seen that in action is it comes down, this is what I do, you do it this way. And that is not a teach back session. It is the relationship and how I think about what I do. And one of the reasons that sometimes it's difficult to get going is it does question, Lisa, if you're teaching me about something that you're thinking about what you do, sometimes it can actually question your own thinking and you can realize there are gaps. Are you ready for that?
Well, that's what I think we should be. It's not a matter of, are you ready for it? I mean, you're a teacher.
Yeah, but some of you said earlier yourself, it's a private profession. We've hardly ever had these discussions in our past. We talk about what we do, not how we think what we do. It's safer. It's cautious. And that's where I think the biggest issue in education is courage.
But then again, is courage being really supported?
It comes down to school leadership. So we work in many schools throughout the world and we can get this working. It doesn't take long to get it working. It requires good leadership that creates trust, that creates a sense of fairness, who does it themselves. You used the magic words before, who are open to learn themselves. It comes from the top. We know from Helen Timberley's work, they have to be there in the room as part of this all the time. You don't delegate this as a school leader. This is your core job, is how you build that collective efficacy across the school. And so, yes, it can happen. The fascination for me is, how come we can't scale it up? How come even in my own work, every time a principal changes, we always go back to square one? We love this notion that this school's my school, I'm going to do it my way. We're not very good at scaling.
So And have you got any plans how to change that?
Yes, that's what our work is at the moment, is that whole notion of scaling up success. And part of it is winning the hearts and minds of the teachers, making sure you don't ever tell a teacher how they should teach, looking at their thinking about what they mean by impact, switching the conversation from, I don't care how you teach, Lisa, I care about the impact of your teaching. Nearly every teacher in the world came into this profession for one reason. They wanted to have an impact on kids.
Yeah.
All we're doing is reminding them of that. What do you mean by impact? How would you know you're being successful? How many kids are getting that impact? And what is the magnitude of that impact? That's the focus of our work. And we can grow schools dramatically. But as I said, new superintendent, new director general, new principal. No, we're not going to do that. That's the fad. We're going to do something completely different. I believe in X. We're going to do this. So we don't maintain success. And I've seen some stunning schools destroyed by a new principal. I remember one here in Melbourne. It was for 5 years in a row. It was in the top 5 schools in the state in terms of its growth projectile. Now, it was a school in a lower SES area, so the achievement wasn't at the top of the scale. But the progress that those teachers were making those kids was top 5 years in a row, almost impossible. That new principal said, no, all the kids aren't above average, therefore we're going to stop what we're doing. And she introduced some program that just destroyed the school. But she got her favourite program in place. We're not very good at building on others. We want to leave our mark, and that's unfortunate. Same with systems. We chop and change. Like, I've been in my aitsl role, which is the chair of a government agency, for 8 years. In that 8 years across Australia with our various states and territories, if you count the number of director generals and ministers of education, I'm up to 61. We change a lot at the top. So lots of change at the top, but when you go into a classroom over 9 years, it's hardly changed. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. As I say, about 9 years ago, I was invited by the government to chair the federal government's, the only agency they own, which is the Australian Institute for Teaching and School Leaders. It's responsibility for the professional standards for teachers, for initial teacher education, and for school leaders. Obviously, I'm very biased. I think it's done a wonderful job, and it's always got more to do. But one of the reasons I was intrigued to take on the job was to be more involved in policy, to work with ministers and director generals. Part of my role is to implement their policies, and obviously to advise. And so I've thoroughly enjoyed doing that. These people certainly know the research. They certainly have a mission to make a difference. Sometimes, like in federal politics, they don't own a single school. In state politics, they do own the schools. And then we've also got in Australia the independents and the Catholic system. So I meet with all these people quite a regular basis. And I have to say it's a very healthy debate. But I do get frustrated that so often we look for a problem and we have a policy to fix a problem, but it's very hard to have a policy to scale up success. Very hard. But that's what I'm working on, and I'm certainly trying to get this notion of expertise in the water all the time about our business. Not just talking about the expert teachers, but talking about the expertise to grow in our profession. Like, I worry, and I don't know the figures in Australia, but I do in the UK and Australia, but there's now as many amateurs in the classroom as there are professional teachers. We have more teaching aides and resource people in schools than we have teachers. Now, I don't know how that was allowed to happen. Those teaching aides have a 0 to negative impact on their students on average, but we've allowed them. We love them. We think they're wonderful. How we allowed the deprofessionalisation so strong? And I look to your country in Sweden, where you've allowed private enterprise to come in and run schools and get away with incredibly low quality, and then they turn around and say they haven't got enough money. Give us more. I just think that is a major, major nightmare. So as I understand the Swedish education, the mistake you made is that when you privatise schools, you never put in a clause where if they didn't succeed, you got those schools back. So you've lost them. And I know that many of the ex-politicians are now promoting and funding those schools. So you've got this really very powerful lobby. And it's almost to the situation where they threaten they will close the schools and therefore cause chaos in schools around them. And I know that you've set up various commissions to try and fix it. In fact, I've been invited one of your previous ministers to be on it, but as you just said, I don't speak Swedish. So I said, no, this is a local issue. But I don't think there's much courage to solve that problem. And in the meantime, we love you because you've slipped down the PISA ranks a lot more than we have.
But you know what? Yes, but the tide is turning in Sweden. Where there's a will, there is a way. But when are you coming to Sweden?
Well, look, I'd love to come back as travel has starting to open again. I've certainly started to starting travel, and I would love to come back. I have some very good friends. We ran a lot of visible learning schools in Sweden a few years ago, and some wonderful colleagues that I have there and working in schools. I would love to come back.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you this afternoon. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Good talking to you too, and please enjoy Perth and then when you go back to Sweden.
Thank you. And you have been listening to the podcast Sånt, livet i Sverige, or in English, That's Life in Sweden, with me, Lisa Åsmäki. And of course, I'm not podcasting from Sweden because I am currently in Melbourne here in Australia, where I will be doing a few more recordings and interviews with fascinating academics and researchers. But till next time, take care of yourself and each other's. Bye for now.